Yeah, I think it's worth parsing this statement really carefully, Yvonne. Now, we are fortunate. We can get a sense of what Australia did and didn't manage to achieve because we've got a draft copy of what Australia was proposing back at the end of last year when it first circulated the Melbourne Declaration as it would like to see it. And comparing the two documents is quite useful. You can get a sense of what Australia did and didn't get. Now, one of the most pressing, not the only, but one of the most pressing issues, of course, that leaders here have been grappling with is regional security, maritime security. And one of the things that journalists, among others, were looking at was what would they have to say about the South China Sea, given that it involves a number of ASEAN members who have territorial clashes with China, and given that that was powerfully demonstrated just this week when we saw yesterday Chinese and Philippines Coast Guard vessels colliding with one another, the Chinese vessel turning on essentially an enormous fire hose onto that Philippines vessel, smashing through the glass, injuring some sailors. So what were leaders going to say? Now, Australia, when you look at the original draft, wanted ASEAN to issue a very strong statement by its standards indeed. It wanted a clear denunciation against the militarisation of features in the South China Sea. That's a clear reference to China. It also wanted a reference to the 2016 arbitral award, which essentially found that China has no right to those contested territories under law. And originally wanted that initial statement to essentially call on both parties, which is code for China, to abide by it. Now, neither of those two things made the final statement. When you look through the Melbourne Declaration, that reference to the 2016 ruling is gone, and you don't hear anything or read anything about militarised features. Instead, you've got a more general call for the importance of peace and stability. It recognises the importance of peace in the region, and a more generalised call for all parties to avoid taking actions which might endanger that stability. So you can see very clearly here, Yvonne, what's happened. Those states that are closest to China have basically refused to back language that could be perceived as hostile to Beijing, particularly on this very sensitive subject. It's another bit of evidence of just how sensitive these subjects are and how ASEAN remains incapable of forming a really concerted or united position on some of these really important but fraught strategic questions.
And Stephen, how has the crisis and war in Gaza featured in the talks?
Yeah, there were quite a few discussions, obviously, not just this week, but in the lead-up to the summit about what would be said on Israel and Gaza. Now, obviously, this is not happening in Southeast Asia, as the South China Sea dispute is, but nonetheless, it's an important issue. And unsurprisingly, some countries in Southeast Asia feel very strongly about it. Malaysia and Indonesia, for example, have both made it very, very clear that they are extremely hostile to what Israel has done. They see the West's broad approach as a hypocritical one. They think much stronger action needs to be taken to try and denounce Israel and ramp up pressure on it to pull out of Gaza. Now, what we've got in the end, as we've got with the South China Sea, is unsurprisingly a compromise. Australia and some other states, including Singapore, simply weren't willing to back some of the really strident language, or what they perceived as really strident language on Israel. Instead, we've got a more generalised call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and also a call for Israel to allow in humanitarian aid. On top of that, it's worth noting we also do have an indirect denunciation of the terrorist attacks on October 7 from Hamas, something that you'd imagine Malaysia, which still recognises Hamas, would have had to have conceded. It wouldn't have wanted that in there in the first place. So, as ever, Yvonne, diplomacy is the art of compromise. It's an imperfect art. Every country has to get together and reach an agreement. And what we see is something really that all nations can live with, even if none of them are necessarily delighted by the full content.
And overall, Stephen, how did the summit go? What was your assessment? Was it a success?
Look, I think it was a success. It's difficult to judge these things, and in a sense, we'll only get a true sense of its success down the track. If you look, for example, at Australia's major initiatives to try and boost Australian investment in Southeast Asian infrastructure and clean energy, those initiatives, they were definitely welcomed by Southeast Asian leaders, all of whom were very warm about that, unsurprisingly. But what the real litmus tests for that will be whether it works or not. So we'll only only know whether those mechanisms have been successful, 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the track when we actually try and track how Australian investment has gone. We've seen initiatives before from Australia to boost investment in Southeast Asia, most recently back in 2018 at the last ASEAN summit, and it didn't succeed in moving the needle. So will it be different this time? Possibly, quite possibly, but we won't know for sure until we can actually look at the numbers down the track. All of that said, Yvonne, Australian officials seem pretty pleased with how this summit's gone. Certainly Southeast Asian leaders feel like it was a good program. They feel, I'm told, like they've been treated with an appropriate amount of respect. The dialogues along the side seem to move very smoothly, and Australian officials at least are very pleased by those one-on-one interactions between the Prime Minister and Southeast Asian leaders. So they think it will make a difference in Australia's strategic circumstances in the region. I think that's probably true. But of course, I think we also have to be realistic. All of the things that Australia's doing here are very worthwhile indeed, but in the end, we can't control the broader strategic circumstances or the actions of the great powers. And while Southeast Asian states and Australia have agency, to some degree, progress, regional peace and regional prosperity is still dependent on that broader strategic picture. If war were to break out between China and the US, for example, in the Taiwan Strait, or if conflict were to escalate rapidly in the South China Sea, drawing in the US, then all the initiatives Australia announces in the world are not going to make much of a difference if the region finds itself in a very, very precarious place. So progress, yes. Success, yes, probably. But the bigger picture still has to be kept in mind.
Stephen Dziedzic in Melbourne, thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. Appreciate it.